Anyway, so you answered it, right?
I was beginning to. The book went through many titles, and I kept on going back and forth because it is a comedy, and I did want a title that was somewhat funny. And the book is, of course, about funny things, but also about serious things. So we do have a heroine who is a fashionista, a boyfriend-obsessed fashionista, who discovers, to her amazement, that she actually does have ambitions and that she wants success in the world, apart from fashion and men. So I did feel that her revelation, her internal revelation about feminism was kind of the motivator in the book, although comically.
Were you ambitious as a young woman? Is this somewhat autobiographical?
I was not an ambitious young woman at all. I was, I think, very muddled, like a lot of young women are. I do think that I found clothes and men more interesting to think about than careers. But life changes you. And even if we try to be unserious, we ultimately have to get somewhat more serious.
Does the kind of social education that Bella received, does this differ in the world of men? I mean, how do men and women differ, and how are they the same in terms of how they approach career and their social lives?
Well, obviously that's changed over generations. I just did not grow up, even though I had a father who was about as pro-feminist as a man can be. And he always told me I could be smarter in math and science than any boy in the class, and that I could do anything I wanted to. I think where he thought I could do anything, I don't think either of my parents encouraged me to think about what that would be. And having the ability to do things and wanting to succeed in them are very, very different things. And historically, women have been very good at doing all kinds of things, but haven't considered it a career. And we can think, and now we have this explosion of careers in America where everybody is doing all the things that women did for free. I mean, think about daycare, think about dog walkers, think about wedding planners. I mean, we can go down a list of things that are now jobs in America. Think about the nonprofit world, which is now highly paid jobs. Those are all jobs women did for free, that they considered part of their role in the community. So I think it's a complex thing. Men have always thought that they had to support a family, they had to work for money. They often had many children to support. So I think that the education, yes, was extremely different, and all the residues of that are in the culture. I think it's the best way we can think about it.
So in your book, what does Bella not know about being successful that the men in her life do know?
That's an interesting question, because I don't think she actually thinks of the word success. I think that that's actually an absent term for her, as it is for a lot of women. She thinks about doing things, but I don't think she actually even uses the word success. She thinks that her boyfriend should be successful. Her ambitions in the beginning of the book are all on behalf of him. I mean, the irony of the book is that the stubbornness and the persistence that she applies to helping her boyfriend ultimately are what land her a career. But she doesn't actually have a notion for herself. Even though she's doing very well in grad school, she actually never defines it as any kind of success, or that she wants actually to be head of a department or do anything. I think it's a word that's absent.
I mean, do you think that the whole idea that basically love is your career is something that women still think about now in the way that they used to think about it?
Love is a career. I don't think I think, first of all, everybody wants love. All human beings want love. So I don't think that's a male-female thing. I think everyone walking the earth wants to be loved. I think that's an extremely human need. The question is of how much completeness we're going to find in having marriage or partnership or family or any of that. And men have never been given the option historically to think of love as the only thing that is going to sustain them. But up to very, very recently, that is what women were not only told, but were limited to. So I think that we have to think about historically that really what we're talking about is jobs open to women, careers open to women, really what, a century old? So I think that it's a complex issue.
Well, were the men that she's involved with or the institution a hindrance because they didn't have an idea of women's ambition? I mean, is this something that was not just them, it was the way the environment was?
Bella is very successful in grad school, and there are no hindrances to her. So I went out of my way in this book, partly because it's comedy, but also because of personal feelings. There are no evil men in this book. The men are not nasty, they're not barriers, they're all very interesting, they have their quirks, but they're not actually hindrances to her. And I think that, as in a lot of comedies, she's mostly getting in her own way.
What's critical in your thought today that you wished you knew at Bella's age?
Life is so long. I think the main thing is, I have been through so many careers. I bounced around a lot. And I think as a young woman, like Barbara Alfaro, I trained in the theater, and I had a childhood, filled with one kind of ambition and goal. And when that didn't work out, I then, I entered academia. I worked in independent film. And I just kept on bouncing around. And I wish somebody had told me that would be okay. That really the bouncing around, and that I didn't really have to pick one thing. And if you had told me at Bella's age that I would be writing, I would have laughed in your face. It just would have seemed inconceivable. I thought, well, why would I want to do that? Why would I wake up in the morning and want to write? And then at a certain point in my life, I was waking up in the morning and I wanted to write more than I wanted breakfast. And if anyone had told me that, I just would have laughed. So I think that the idea that I had as a young woman that I would find some passion, and in my mind, it was going to be equivalent to theater. It was going to be something that was really immersive, and that I would then be on that path. And it just turned out that life doesn't look that way. It doesn't have to look that way. And it's not wrong when it isn't that way.
Now, what makes Closet Feminist a comedy? Because we're talking about the themes, and they're serious themes. So basically, what's comic about it? I mean, how does that happen?
I hope you laugh, first of all. So I hope that is what makes it a comedy. No, more seriously, since I had written another book about women and ambition, The Looking Glass, which approaches ambition from a non-comic way, comedy is an optimistic form. Comedy takes serious issues, often about social class, often about, as in Bella's case, sexual relationships and ambition, and it gives them an optimistic slant. It does not think that everything in life has to end up, as in literary fiction, in some ambiguous, uncertain vacuum, it actually takes people to a comfortably happy place. Not where everything, not, in today's comedy, we don't wrap up the box. We can leave some ends open, but the view of life is optimistic. I also want to say that in writing this as a comedy, I had a rule, and that the comedy never could be mean. I was extremely careful. I went through every line of dialogue, and I made sure that no joke was mean-spirited or at anyone's expense. That turns out to be a lot harder than most people realize, because a lot of today's late night comedy, a lot of what we call comedy, is extremely sarcastic, it's extremely smug, it's at someone else's expense. It's extremely easy to write that way because it's not really coming from character. You can just make fun of, some political figure or something that happened in the news in as nasty a way as you like, and you can spin that off for hours. It's actually much harder to write comedy that's completely character-based and is never, ever at anyone else's expense. So that was my big rule in writing this book.
Okay. So I'm going to segue that one into the emotional lives of men and women. How are they different? And is it biological or conditioned? Like, I don't imagine that there are a lot of comic male novels that don't have set up characters who they're mean-spirited to. I mean, I think that's a very feminine viewpoint, actually.
I'm going to differ. Okay.
Okay.
I have two big models in writing this book, and they're both male writers. And one is the British writer, P.G. Wodehouse. And I very much was conscious of Bertie when I was writing Bella, because Bertie's humor is always at his own expense. And Bertie is unfailingly generous and kind. He gets himself in trouble because he is so generous and kind. And it always ends up wrong. What he wants to do always backfires. And then he has, his valet Jeeves to save him. And my other big inspiration in comedy was Ring Lardner, the very undervalued American writer who died young, who wrote the baseball novel, You Know Me, Al. And that humor and that sticking to the vernacular voice, again, is never nasty, never sarcastic. And yeah, so those are really the two. The other model I had was the novels of Laurie Colwin.
Right.
Whose early death was a great tragedy for all of her fans. Because there again, you have this extremely generous, kind comedy and very complex observations about men and women. So I think I departed from your question now.
Yeah, I was asking, how does the emotional life of men differ from women, and is it biological or conditioned?
Well, I'm not actually a scientist in that way.
Well, we can go on if you don't want to answer.
I think human beings are very complicated.
Okay.
And that to sort of say that, men and women have some different concerns, because women I do think are hardwired. Even if you're like me and you didn't have children, I think we do have a kind of internal clock that makes us receptive to taking care of people. That maybe isn't as ever present in men. And I think, probably that men are more comfortable with taking charge in a meeting. And the language of men, which is so often about beating someone else or taking charge or getting ahead. When I first entered corporate America, I was really struck by how much of the language seemed military. We need a battle plan here. I'm like, really? We're on television here. What's the battle? We've got to get ahead. We've got to get a march, and a lot of the language, and we had a war room. when I worked at home box office, one of my big confusions was, we've got to go to the war room. And I thought, is this cable television? Is there some war on that I'm not aware of? And it turned out that the war room was just a room for scheduling home box office shows. And I remember sitting and all the men were like, well, and, and they were very, very comfortable with thinking they were right. And it took me a long time to figure out that, first of all, mostly they were wrong. I mean, their facts were wrong. They weren't like me, a geek with the data. They were just saying stuff. But also that I really had to learn how to just say, no, I'm right. Because I wasn't really comfortable doing that. I thought you're supposed to sit around and listen. And I realized if you do that, then you've, quotes, lost the meeting. So I think that is something now. Is that socialized? Is that conditioned? I don't really know. I know it's a big difference. And also, I also have to say that having worked in corporate America, there were several times I saw women cry in meetings. They got so upset about what someone else had said to them, which in my mind was just about business and not something I would ever spend time crying about. But their feelings were so easily bruised that they actually cried. And men didn't really seem to care what other people said to them. I was like, screw you. So you don't like me. So you think I'm wrong. Whereas, and they didn't walk away from meetings saying things like, I felt Susan betrayed me. I never heard such a thing from a man, but I often heard it from women that they felt betrayed, they felt hurt. So they were taking the whole business meeting, which I more or less regarded as a joke, as this very serious interpersonal interaction, in a way that men were not. They just were not.
So, I mean, you could say to some extent, like we have a couple questions about when Bella gets to start to know herself, where she's not just acting a role, what's expected of her. And it sounds like the point that you were attending these meetings, you already had a handle on who you were.
Yes.
So in terms of her journey, does this come about after she stops trying to have her love interest be more important than her jobs? And I mean, how does her trajectory, how does this kind of come about?
I think the book, for most of the book, I think she is actually not that aware. It actually takes her till almost the end, where she actually has an awareness of the kinds of choices and decisions she is willing to make and the trade-offs she is willing to make, because the book makes it clear that there are trade-offs, that you don't get to have everything on a plate handed to you. And if you want one thing, you may be giving up other things. So I think that that's actually a very slow journey for her, a very slow journey. But the interesting thing is that she's very, very stubborn when she's fighting for her boyfriend's career. And there, she's completely unapologetic and like a steamroller.
Okay, so in other words, there are ways that she does what's expected of women, and they work out. And then there's a lot of stuff that doesn't work out. And she does learn something from the experiences that don't work out, right? So there is in this journey some of this back and forth between what's expected and what actually does matter. And I guess the question I have is, most women, is there one incident in her life and Bella's trajectory that kind of causes this, or at what point does she find herself and then things that she thought that mattered didn't? I mean, without giving away the whole plot.
Well, I think I structured the book so that the big thing that happens for Bella, the inciting incident, is more or less a comic blunder. She meets a film director in a bakery. He turns out to be related to a member of her faculty, and then she meets him again at a party. And she decides to take it on herself to push her boyfriend's career. So it's really an accident that she meets him, but it's not an accident that she then ropes him in to listening to her proposition about her boyfriend. But that's actually what sets the book in motion, is her meeting Skylo at the party. And I based the film director, he's sort of a mashup of many men that I met when I was working in independent film. I used to meet all these cool but very messy film directors, and I sort of mashed them up into the Skylo character. And he's an interesting contrast, because if you're talking about differences between men and women, Bella is spending all of her time arranging her outfits and worrying about what to wear. And I make it very clear that Skylo is a complete slob. So she's spending hours with her vintage clothing, and Skylo is becoming a very, very successful film director. And he's always, she always describes him as needing a shave, being completely sloppy, wearing a sweatshirt. So he's clearly not, all that energy that she's putting into her appearance, the men are not putting in that energy. They don't need to do that. But that doesn't mean I've given up my clothes obsession, by the way.
So a question I have is that young women entering academia or business, I mean, they do think that they need the clothes and that they need a role that they have to adopt in order to be able to enter those worlds. And anything else they find out is kind of confusion, I think, to some extent. Why are women at such a disadvantage where men consider it kind of their right to be in these domains?
There are a lot of questions in there.
Yeah. Well, answer whatever you want.
But let's take clothes. Both of my books, both The Looking Glass and A Closet Feminist, are very focused on clothes in different ways. And I am very obsessed with, and my mother loved vintage clothing and had a vintage clothing store for a while. I think my first insight about women in clothes came from my niece as a baby. I visited my sister, who has no interest in fashion, and my niece hardly spoke at all. She hadn't really developed full vocabulary. And I was wearing either a scarf or a piece of jewelry, and the baby leaned over to me and with her little finger said, "Pretty." And I thought, now this is extraordinary. She hardly can speak. It's not as if her mother is telling her about fashion or jewelry, but she's interested in whatever I was wearing. And there was pure ecstasy on her little baby face. And I thought, this is something really important to girls and women that may just not be as important to men. And we know scientifically, by the way, that men are much more likely to be colorblind. That's just true. Color blindness is largely a masculine phenomenon. Women are extremely sensitive to colors. So I think, getting back to the point in the book, I mean, Bella spends a lot of time worrying about how she looks. It's first focused on weight. She's focused on, when she first goes to graduate school, her major concern is has she overdressed for the reception, because if she, being from her kind of background, has gotten all dressed up and put on her heels and thought it was a fancy thing, and then she's very astonished to find everyone in flannel and khaki, and not at all what she thought you wear to a reception. That's something she's very focused on. A lot of her energy is put into that. I don't think at the end that she will stop being as fashion obsessed. I think that is part of her personality, but she'll put it to different uses for sure.